Just to check, are we currently being streamed? No, that's fine. I just wanted to know. POIs in the chat, please. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Two things in this speech. Firstly, how having geographical representation artificially distorts people's democratic preferences. Secondly, why I think we get better politics and better policy. First argument, we think that structurally, people's interests are far more likely to align by age rather than their geographic location for two reasons. The first is that you tend to have similar economic interests across age groups. That is, almost all old people want nice pensions. By and large, they tend to have large amounts of money, but they want high income tax because they don't have large amounts of income that they're being earned. Middle-aged people, conversely, probably want lower income taxes and lots of support for working, no matter how much money they end up making. Young people, by and large, want things like free university or the ability to easily join the workforce, regardless of the amount of money or the area from which they come. But secondly, because I think socially, it tends to be the case that your social views correlate very strongly by age, because the social values you have tend to be determined by a large extent by the values of the society in which you grew up. For instance, if you grew up in a time where the death penalty was acceptable, you're statistically far more likely to believe that the death penalty is the thing that should happen. I think the response is like, okay, sure, that could be a phenomenon, but equally it correlates based on geographic location. I think one, it's just empirically the case, for instance, that even within Texas, the vast majority of young people tend to vote Democrat. But secondly, that the rate of progress is so fast that society today is still far more similar between, say, I don't know, New York and Texas, to keep talking about the United States, than it is with either of those places 50 years ago. So I think to a large extent is the case that people's preferences more closely align. Why does this matter? I think this matters because it means that you're almost certainly guaranteed to have a representative who aligns with your views under our side of the house. Because even if it's like some kind of first past the post system, this means that you're almost always within your like age group seat going to have a overwhelming majority for the candidate that represents the majority of people. Or if you have some kind of proportional representation system, you're still going to be very likely assigned a candidate who agrees with your views. Why do we think that this is a really important thing as opposed to the status quo where, for instance, like in tight seats, 49% of people might vote for the Liberal Party and end up not getting a representative who appeals to them? Number one, I think it's significantly more likely that people are going to be politically engaged. The problem is that under the status quo, the vast majority of seats are uncompetitive because it tends to be that the rate of population change within an area is relatively slow. Even if you have a very unpopular government, it tends to be that in like out of a 1,000-seat election, maybe there's a 200 or so seat change, but the vast majority of seats always have the same party winning again and again. The problem is that if you are not being represented, this particularly means that you often don't want to turn out because you feel like there's nothing that you could do that could make your voice count. This is especially true because, as we'll prove later, most election systems tend to be first past the post. But even if that's not the case, these people often set local policy and you feel like politics is structurally unable to represent you, which means that I think people are less likely to vote in the long run. Under our side, they're more likely to have a representative who seems to care about them, which means that they are likely to turn up again and again. I think this is really important because there's currently a chicken and egg problem, which is that young people especially feel like there's no way for them to be represented, tend to have a poor history of voting because the system tends to appeal to the interests of the middle and upper classes and people who have large amounts of income, and therefore they're less likely to vote, therefore they're less likely to be represented. Merely by making sure that they're a bigger force means that it's significantly more likely that these underrepresented groups, whoever they are more likely to get representation. Even if that's nominal, we think that's a good thing. The second thing that I think here is true here is that you're just far more likely to have your vote count, which we think means that the system is more likely to be democratic. The vast majority of electoral systems around the world are first past the post, which means that within a prefixed electoral district, if 51% of people vote for the given representative, then that representative represents the whole place, which means that a large number of people aren't represented. Why is this likely to be the case? One, because these are the electoral systems of France and Britain, which colonized much of the world and set up latent democracies, and the United States, which had the ability to impose democracy after World War II across much of the world. Secondly, because there is a putative benefit, which is you can also, at the same time as electing the national party, say specifically who your local representative is going to be, which is not something that happens in proportional representation systems where post-fact you get allocated a representative. We think, therefore, that in their side of the house, it is likely that people's voices don't count when you have these very diverse groups. For instance, in major cities, we have a large number of young people that vote Liberal, but also a large number of old people that vote Conservative. This changes because now almost everyone gets their vote counted because they tend to vote in seats where they agree, which means that we don't get the structural underrepresentation of people. But secondly, your ability to do gerrymandering, merely to create different districts merely on the basis of geography, that happens fairly frequently because you do want to make sure that districts get resized based on the number of people in them if there's been population growth, goes away, which means that it's much harder to do things like structural underrepresentation of minority groups under our side of the House. We think just making sure that almost everyone gets their voices counted, that it's much harder to just structurally exclude young people or people who live in weird geographic areas by gerrymandering. It's in and of itself a good thing because we are somewhat agnostic about what correct policy is, and in principle, democracy ought to represent people. Closing.
Okay, firstly, this isn't this House believes motion. You don't have any fiat power to introduce an alternative to first past the post within your age system. But secondly, you lose vital constituency links, which would be useful for the people you want to represent.
Okay, that's two POIs. I'm only compelled to respond to the first one. We haven't said first past the post will go, but if everyone in your district has the same preference, that 49% is no longer not represented structurally by the system, which means that we're far more likely to actually represent people. We have done no fiating thus far. Second thing, how does politics change? The first thing to say is we think that now a lot of fringe young people that have relatively liberal views that are structurally underrepresented often are now much more likely to be represented because now there might be, say, an 18 to 20 age seat or like 20 of them that is possible for specific political parties like the Greens that young people tend to support much more frequently to vote. Why is the existence of these parties and their ability to not be subsumed by the like general left party a good thing? The first is, I think, that just making sure these parties can stand out against this like homogeny of two-party systems means that it's easier for you to hold out, for instance, by not voting for the left on a specific policy in exchange for specific concessions, which means that we're likely to get a more diverse representation of views by having a more diverse political system under our side of the House. But secondly, because I think in specific, young people often are more likely to do things like promote change for climate change, and I think that's a really important thing. The second thing I'd say is that I think regional representation itself is better because under the status quo, certain regions happen to be right in the middle of the political spectrum, which means that people often compete for their seats because they're swing voters or because it's not the central limit theorem, the central voter theorem, is that the one? Means that they're just far more likely to get representation under our side. This structurally underrepresents often the lowest income regions. Under our side of the House, we think when you have a youth policy with universities everywhere, worst case, that structurally underrepresents the old people, but at least every region gets given money, which means that there is a trickle down to poorer economies anyway, which means that the costs of underrepresentation are much lower under our side because old people tend to live near middle-aged people and so on. Very proud to propose.
Thank that Prime Minister for the very fine speech, and we now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, I'll take POIs in chat. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things in this speech. First of all, why this is principally an abrogation of your right to simply be represented in most cases. And secondly, why this is an extraordinarily bad way of organizing any means of national representation. Before that, I have a few rebuttals. The first is towards their broad claim that most interests align by age. This is first just an assertion. There's no reason for why everyone wants the same thing, even if they might somewhat experience the same problem. Like young people might want free university. This seems to me like quite untrue since many, especially the young alt-right members of society, see this as a bad policy and see this as like profligate spending, especially for many who can already afford university. It seems to me like it's just as easy to point out the counterexamples where people do heavily disagree, which is why many old people don't actually vote for nice pensions because they've had the time to accumulate these resources. So no, it just seems to me on face like the proof that government has categorically chosen for people's interest aligning is just untrue. The only other structural reason they have is just that many young people grew up in the same social areas and in the same like social milieu, which means that they hold the same values. First, this is an assertion. They may have different reactions to these values. Secondly, many of these social milieus are determined by the very geographic area that you're living in, whether you're living in one that is predominantly Democratic or predominantly Republican may influence the social circles that build up around you, which are, guess what, determined by the people that you live nearby, which is determined by geography. So the precondition for their material to be true is for our material to be even truer, which is why their side is simply untrue when they claim that interests aligned by age. Their positive proof isn't nearly enough, and the only structural reason they've given is not at all true. Secondly, though, they say, well, because of this policy, it's hard to do things like have structural unrepresentation and exclude poor people and exclude young people. The first observation I make is, actually, it seems much easier. If what you're saying is true, that there's a fairly strong consensus among most voters in a particular age group, then it seems to me that for those who are particularly cleaved against that specific consensus, maybe there is a very strong consensus for free university for people in rural areas or for people in urban areas, but for people who live outside of these areas, for people who are in that age group but don't agree with that, it seems to me like they have the same problems of not broadly being represented within Congress. It seems to me like a problem that doesn't get solved, but moreover gets worse, presuming that you entrench these strong consensuses, which means that you're stuck within this one voter cohort for the entirety of your life, which precisely means that in fact you have no means to opt out, as opposed to some means to opt out in a geographic system where you could otherwise move or gradually build up power to eventually change the system as the population changes over time. So now that's government out of the way, both principally bunk and just materially bunk. Two things in the speech then. First of all, why do we group people to begin with? So we group people because we obviously can't have every single person's opinion be represented in the national legislature, and some form of apportionment is some distortion to the democratic will. So this debate is about the most acceptable form of distortion to the democratic will. Why do we need to subdivide this group into one of geography rather than age? The first is I make the basic observation that age is an extraordinarily bad way of doing this. Aside from the fact that it's rather arbitrary, since it's unclear why people who are 35 can't live the exact same circumstances as those who are 43, but they're arbitrarily set into different groups. The age that you are at actually says little to nothing about the circumstances that you are living in, since it's a poor proxy for other things like economic needs. It might be true in the extremes, like maybe you need to go to university at some points in your life, and maybe you need to, have pension at some points in your life. But in most cases, the actual life circumstance that you're in, the job that you might be doing, will vary most heavily based on geographic preference. So why is geography comparatively a better approximation of shared interests or will? 3 reasons. 1, shared economic conditions. Geography is telling of shared resources, geography, other economic factors like the opportunity to go to things like school and so on that determine your opportunities in life. Secondly, geography is a telling of access to state services. How far are you from the nearest hospital? How much control does the central government have in your area, for example? And thirdly, it's more telling of shared cultural nuances and values. While it's not perfect, people who interact and deal with and talk to one another on a day-to-day basis are more likely to adhere to social values versus like a 20-year-old in California and a 30-year-old in rural Alabama. Moreover, national policy interacts with geography in a way that cleaves more strongly between these geographical lines rather than age lines. National conditions have different effects depending on the specific area that you're in. Migration is much more likely to affect border towns over non-border towns. Trade agreements affect certain industries over others, which predominate in certain areas. Geography acts as a strong proxy for economic success, but also national policy. So we think subdividing it in this way is comparatively more just. But moreover, we think that there are a variety of other reasons for why this would be extraordinarily bad. The first is that this also increases substantially the amount of arbitrariness inherent to the system of government, where you may consent in some situations to the regime that you are presently in, but by definition of the fact that you are aging in government, you are forced to transition to a regime that you don't consent to, one with entirely new laws, one that effectively has different punishments for different laws, one that has different apportionments for things like the national budget, for things like education, right? When you may still be studying, for example, but you're forced to cut off these dreams because you're past a certain age. These are the things that you don't consent to, that they maximally increase on government because they force people to opt into a constant system of shifting they have very little control over, especially as they're forced to opt into these things. Thirdly, also, representation is just far less efficacious on their side. So even if it is true that they get slightly better principled representation, this actually results in worse policies and less actual state funding to execute these policies in a way that is meaningful to people. There are distributional challenges in enforcing every one of these national elections, every one of these parties, or every one of these state legislatures to be able to do things on a national scale at the same time. This has redundancy harms, like requiring national networks to overlap for many different age groups. It has enforcement harms, requiring government infrastructure that is simply not available, and campaigning processes for a particular age groups to be entirely for the entire country, raising massively the amount of money that you would have to raise as a candidate in order for you to be able to represent people. Extraordinarily, so simply speaking, they have far worse representative options in the first place. The representative options have far less resources to be able to actually cater to people. And thirdly, is that the actual catering that they do is more divergent to the actual preferences that people have at hand. I'll take a PY from CG. Sorry, OG.
Your distribution challenges sound like a logistical issue that can be fixed with an analysis of utility rather than based on the existing system where political leaders with higher preferences and higher power end up getting their way.
But I just like to make the basic observation that this analysis of utility, this exertion of state resources, comes at the cost of other forms of representation that people care about. All this money they're spending, like building an entirely new state infrastructure and legislature, is one that you're spending not giving food to people, not giving healthcare to people. So comparatively speaking, we actually get better policies in any case. Lastly, then, we also think that this harms election dynamics and causes a massive amount of unrepresentation for a large group of people, that is to say, old people. We think if you're likely to see a race to get younger voters, presumably, because you may still care about these people because they may vote for you in the future. We think the problem is that for many of these people whom now you're forcing to vote to represent several different constituencies at the same time, you're forcibly splitting up these things due to a factor that they had literally no control over. That is, they literally cannot control the circumstances of aging. That is to say that for many of these people, they're ending up being forced to split their resources with lots and lots of other age groups for the reason that these specific age groups are at a particular point of this privilege, for the reason that they're forced to cater to those that are younger to them because they will inevitably become their voters. So even in the worst case, it's a principled disjunct with the actual form of policy that we want, where there's no actual winning scenario. So it's either that they do get represented or that they don't, and in either scenario, things are substantially worse for the broader political system. At the end of the speech, it is quite clear. This is undemocratic, bad, and unjust. For these reasons, negate.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech. We now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for OG. Hear, hear.
Hello, please cue on by turning on your videos and waving. And if possible, I would also benefit from people turning on their videos and not messaging anything in the chat, because I get distracted when I get Zoom notifications. The first thing I want to do in this speech is throw out the nonsense about bureaucratic costs and whether you can or can't consent and logistics of how this would be implemented. My first question is, why the hell are there significantly more bureaucratic costs? I want to articulate this policy very, very clearly. There is nothing in this motion that is about radically changing the way in which municipalities and regional governments operate. Rather, it is a question of national decision-making and legislature, upon which it's a simple transition from making representatives, dividing them up according to region to according to age group. Yes, there are going to be points at which you shift from one age group to another, but in the very same way, we acknowledge that different age groups have different preferences right now. Why do we approximate that a 69-year-old might not qualify as a senior senior citizenship card, but a 70-year-old can? It's just approximate, and I think in order to make sense and do things for the common good, we make these approximations all the time. My second main response would be, even in their best case scenario, where there is some incompetent bumbling, I would say that that's much, much less bad than the structural and continuous oppression that Greg explains that we've been trying and failing to deal with for years on end, because bureaucratic fumbling usually can be resolved after a span of 2 or 3 years as we grow to know what happens. Then onto the 3 main ballots for OG. The first ballot is on representation, right? Because let's just note how poor the rebuttal we got from LO was. It was mostly 2 minutes of claiming that we were assertive and mitigation by saying there are fringe cases in which alt-right young people might not want free university, or if I'm super rich as an old person, I might not want a pension. One, let's note that the number of alt-right young people is significantly fewer relative to if we use geographical concentration as a discriminant. But second of all, more importantly, yes, these fringe groups exist. The point is that proxies are always going to be imperfect because there's no way to determine absolutely what everyone's precise needs are. The question is, why is age a significantly better and more concrete estimation of your needs and wants relative to geographic discrimination? So let's compare what we get from these two sides, right? Greg tells you and explains to you that your needs and circumstances are shaped by your biological and economical realities, i.e., if I've just graduated university, I need a fucking job. If I'm turning 25 or 30 and I want kids, I benefit from more childcare. And I think that these needs in here with being the age that you are. There are some fringe cases, but overwhelmingly, people's lifetimes follow a similar trajectory because we're biological creatures and because time is a resource that we all use to do certain things. On the other hand, I think regional distribution is a very, very fuzzy and inaccurate representation of people's wants and needs. Let's first look at the history of why this kind of system of geographical representation representation originated in the first place is because in the aftermath of independence wars and revolutions, people wanted to retain power in their individual areas. And the implication of that was that they wanted geographical concentration as a proxy of power. I think this is artificial and done to artificially increase the amount of power that each individual landlord had. On the comparative, let's note what they actually gave us in terms of similarity. They tell us that there are similar cultural needs, that people interact with each other, and that economic conditions are similar. So the first two are just assertions that people living in the same area are very similar. I would say that these are much less strong than the fact that young people are more similar to each other than old people. And I think I'm not going to bother with this. I think it's unimportant. Let's look at the economic conditions thing. This just thing is significantly more important, right? Two responses to this and reasons why they're less important than what we've told you about age. The first is, this is no longer something that is as true as it was 50 years ago, because the fact that we have built railroads means that economies are much more diverse and diffused across countries. The second main response is that this is highly non-unique, i.e. there are lots and lots of ways in which economic needs are met in the status quo, i.e. I would say that the majority of your regional needs are met by municipal governments, which still exist, and that's the only way in which they're decided. On the other hand, the question of what national priorities should be is something that uniquely can only be decided by a national legislature. So for those reasons, I think we win on representation. Let's note that this means we win not just in terms of what's the best for a democracy, but also in terms of the policy outcomes that arise, right? Young people, by and large, are more progressive. They consider the long term more. They're more likely to make sacrifices in order to prioritize green energy and these kinds of things. I think formalizing their vote and representing them in this way is significantly more likely to lead to positive change. Before I go any further, CO, sorry.
How does the US presidential election system work on opening government?
Like the motion says it does. Okay, cool. Moving on to the second main issue then, which is about correcting power imbalances. So first, what do we get from OO? They give us some quibbles about how smaller minorities end up happening, or you can't opt out of the system because you can't change your age. One, geography is not something you can opt out, but two, I would posit that like the people who can opt out, the very small minority, people who are rich enough to pack up house and move somewhere else because they want to vote for a different MP are, really, really privileged. And it's probably better for us to have something that is universal as opposed to something you buy your way out of. But in terms of smaller minorities, I would just say that majorities are fundamentally more important in democratic systems. But moreover, let's explain why we correct power imbalances, right? Because Greg tells you all about how in the status quo, gerrymandering is used to empower voters, about why young people are structurally locked out of office because structurally they have less money and they're less able to use time and experience and job credentials to run, even though they're human beings like the rest of us and they have preferences that are not met in the status quo. That is one. Obviously represent them now because the motion says so. But two, it's also just the case that we do not concentrate disadvantage in the same way that they do, i.e. I know old people, I know middle-aged people, and I myself am a young person. We're all intermingled, which means that benefits are distributed evenly as opposed to artificially benefiting those who are the most well-off. And I think that this leads me to my third issue, right? Which is that this also bridges gaps and polarization, i.e. we have dispersed versus intermingled forms of voting. And also because there are ties of loyalty and love between generations in which I have parents, I have grandparents, and we all vote, for example. The bottom line is there's significantly more goodwill and understanding when we divide votes based on age rather than when we divide votes based on geography, upon which there are literal miles separating different voter constituencies, and demonization happens so very easily. People's behavior changes because without this demonization, it becomes much harder for politicians to get away with mudslinging as opposed to deliver promises. Let's note that this isn't the only way we can reduce polarization, but it's a significant benefit that arises when we have a more dispersed set of voting. Again, representation is the very heart of this debate. We prevent injustice and we allow for the mechanism to work much more smoothly and have better policy overall. We win the heart of this debate, we win this debate.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and we now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for OO. Hear, hear.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep, you're audible.
All right, great. I'll just fix my camera. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll discuss 3 things. First, age and geography, whether one is a more accurate approximation. Secondly, democratic participation and flipping their benefit. Thirdly, when they concede that you still have the existence of local governments, why is it particularly dangerous for the handling of states? 1. Age versus geography. The first thing I want to note is that their main example is some people want jobs, want to go to university, and other people want pensions. And this is precisely what the problem of using age as the main demarcation of electoral groups is. The first is that these are so incredibly only applicable in the extremes, i.e., yes, maybe young people want jobs that applies until you're 20, 30, 40, 50, until you are at that point of retirement. And therefore, that gives government 2 possible options. The first is that these are such broad age groups, given that these similar interests apply to the general working class and the class that is now dependent on wants pensions. And therefore, the main goal of representation and wanting to ensure that you are able to identify and connect with this group is just not likely to be the case, because 20-year-olds want jobs, 30-year-olds want jobs, and therefore creating big groups of people is not likely to cater to the specific needs of that age group, quote unquote. But secondly, is that it could be so specific that the distinctions start to become incredibly arbitrary. What are the meaningful differences between someone in the 20 to 25 age group and someone from the 25 to 30 age group? And therefore, make it such that this is just a poor proxy for the kind of approximation of will that they want to be able to explain. What they had to do on government was explain what is inherent to age and why does it directly correlate with the kinds of preferences you're able to identify. Because a lot of the things they explain, like your preferences, are equally applicable to things like geographic location. I.e., if young people are more liberal, that is also a consequence of the people that you are able to get together with on a daily basis, the kinds of propaganda or news that you get, which is also determined by your geographic location, or the geographic, both the social institutions that allow you to access them, the people you can talk to, as well as what are the social conditions that are likely to make you liberal or Democrat. That therefore means these are not inherent and therefore should not be the basis. Why is therefore geography far more inherent to this approximation? The first is that a lot of conditions are determined by things that have been arbitrarily placed there before, i.e. local resources and things that were natural to begin with that significantly affect you and definitely interplay with national policy. I.e., if our country makes a free trade agreement with another country, but we know that these specific resources are going to be those that are exported particularly, that is going to affect the same counties and cities that are most likely to take hold of those resources, as opposed to the ones that did not have them to begin with. And therefore, that's a far better approximation of whether or not we should vote for them. And note the particular note on national policy that this explains, because these are things that can only be done on a national level. Other policies like healthcare, tax, etc. can be done locally. Secondly is the access to social institutions, i.e. even if you have things like hospitals, schools, how far are they from your demographic? Are they the type to randomly allocate people who are going to attend them? And these are things that are already based on geography that government does not necessarily change, but are still important policy considerations. But thirdly, national policy particularly, things like immigration, which is far more likely to affect a border city than one that is in the middle of the country. Things like a military that are more likely to, again, affect border areas and protect them rather than the ones that are on the insides. I'd argue these are far closer approximations to the likely social conditions at which you reside rather than age that they have yet to prove is a meaningful way to do this. Secondly, I want to talk about, democratic participation. I first want to note their benefits are equally applicable to the people underrepresented on both sides. If it's the youth on Gov, then it'll be rural areas, small counties that are going to be marginalized on Op. If it's going to be the interest of protecting climate change, I'd also say the interest of protecting the redistribution of national budgets and tax are also important and meaningful things to be able to protect. So this is not a mutually exclusive thing. We don't know why one is necessarily better than the other. What then is inherent and therefore a meaningful difference in this debate? The first is, I'll just overall take this benefit of political participation while less people participate on their side. Because if you only be a member of your electoral group for 5 to 10 years because you're going to grow out of it and move on to the next one, it becomes incredibly difficult to commit political resources because you don't identify with the group because you're only there for 1 or 2 election cycles. You'll probably fail to be attached to them if you'll only be around for 5 years. You're going to campaign for policies that might not be the stance of the next group that you opt into and therefore is difficult for you to want to be able to commit to. Secondly, it's difficult to even identify with these things because it's easy to identify with the people around you, culture, the ability to identify with the people you interact with on a daily basis versus someone who is 25 from California for some reason feeling some degree of obligation to someone who is 25 from Texas. There is no, yay, I'm 25 just like you, we're in that 25 club. But there are lines of state identity, there are lines of national identity that therefore are more strictly correlated to geographic area that make you more likely to want to participate. Then this is impactful because one, if less people participate, That means it's a worse approximation of the actual democratic will because people don't even show up to vote. But secondly, is that insofar as you have poor electoral systems because parties are less likely to allow people to engage and therefore are not going to be meaningful at all, that simply defeats their benefit of wanting to ensure you closely approximate this to begin with. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from CG. If not, then go ahead, OG.
Even if there is some regional disparity in your access to institutions, that still selectively affects people based on age. Not having a hospital near me isn't a problem if I'm young because I'm probably not ill, but it's a huge problem if I'm old. So all your examples are probably symmetric, if anything, true on our side.
No. What I'm saying is that young people who will have more of a vote in capital cities will outvote the young people in rural areas. Old people in these same capital cities will outvote the old people in rural areas because they have more of a population, because they have more population density, because they're wealthier and can more likely lobby governments. This is the inequality we're talking about, that because you don't represent them and assure them 2 seats in the Senate, for example, in the US, you're not going to be able to rectify. We have to be able to take a trade-off in this debate that POI does not. Lastly, there's a lack of coordination because if you can see that there will still be local governments, it means that they can still run on the basis of shared state identity. They can still say that the people in capital cities are taking away their sovereignty and therefore unlikely and unwilling to be able to side with them. Why is that important? Firstly, this is probably just going to take away power from central governments. It's easy to say we should reduce federal tax, we should reduce the ability of governments, we should increase the power to local areas because they are the ones that are more likely to significantly impact and entice people to follow these identitarian lines, which means that any of the benefits Gov gets of important climate change policy, of important benefits to young people, are less likely to be impactful insofar as the state resources needed for this are less necessary. But secondly, is that it's just going to further signify that inequality insofar as rich capital states, which are more likely to cleave along lines of wealth and economic disparity, are more likely to get a hold of resources and not want to share that with other groups and demographics. On Gov, they don't explain whether one group is wealthier, one group is less wealthy. What we explain is that for wealthier demographics and wealthier states, they are far less likely to contribute to national interest, more likely to keep resources for themselves and therefore cater to their own demographics. This is far worse and therefore will lead to far worse national and local policy. For these reasons, oppose? Yeah.
We thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech, and we now welcome the Member of Government to open the bottom half of this debate. Hear, hear.
Just a second. Cool. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Fantastic. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I won't go into this weird cyclical deadlock that the opening half is stuck in because they want to quantify what affects our life more. The harsh reality of it is that, of course, there's a large representation or a large effect of the age, and the way in which our lifestyle is shaped is largely dependent on age. And of course, a lot of it is dependent on the locality I live in. So the exact utility that each contributes is a mathematical equation that neither opening sides have the answer for. What opening half then ends up with is a deadlock here, where O tries to push this idea of a principle to win by saying that at least you can opt out of your locality. But they don't quite compare it to the status quo of the model that Gov has, which is Assuming that this is a model where you elect people based on age, there are likely to be multiple young candidates that want to represent that age group, and maybe lots of people that are young within the same locality will have similar preferences for what their young candidate looks like. Maybe you can move to a new locality and vote for the young candidate that is from there, or that's other young candidate. So I'm just unclear why the opt-out mechanism is exclusive that gives them the principal edge over us. If anything, it's equally difficult on both sides. So the principle from OO cannot win them this debate. The rest of their utility is at best a wash and a deadlock. What exactly will I do to, get prior logic than the weird deadlock the opening half has? The first is the entire opening half is based on a utopian version of what a proper execution of this system looks like. But I'll prove to you why the vast majority of democracies are just not fair. Second, I'll tell you why democracies don't have an inherent principle except achieving good outcomes, and why we achieve better good outcomes for society overall. Those will be my two extensions, engagement inclined within them. Number one, elections are decided on margins, and oftentimes these margins are skewed, even within democratic processes, based on those margins. The best of democracies in the world, even in the United States, often have people that win elections that don't necessarily have popular support. Why is this the case? It's because for the very reasons that you can have marginal decisions change based on the way you draw borders. I think OG analyzes this by using the word gerrymandering, but it's not just gerrymandering based on the fact that you see borders being drawn arbitrarily, but you see it based on arbitrary criteria in different countries and in different ways. It could be based on economic contribution. It could be based on population density that you see in many countries. It could be just based on the principle of equality. The United States is so confused what the criteria should be. They have Congress and Senate with two different sets of criteria because they don't know what the right criteria is. The comparative that OG misses here is, why is age inherently better? And the reason is because age has a linear trend of change. So your ability or your preferences change gradually as you age up. So a person of 25 and a person of 26 does not have a radically different set of preferences because the age in and of itself is incremental. Borders, however, because they're arbitrary, often have radical differences between someone living in two neighborhoods that are next to each other, because you have very radical differences in the way in which you allocate resources, set up livelihoods, donate to hospitals. So a marginal change in a border that those in power can currently do can skew the system far more than marginal changes in age. So even if you increase the age bracket from 30 to 31, you're less likely to get away with screwing with the system. Why is this a debate-winning extension? This shows that the linearity of age prevents the worst excesses and the most, the most oppressive kinds of democracy, not the ideal Western kinds of democracy, but the kinds of democracy you see all across the world, where those in power want to hold on to power and want to skew the system in their favor. That in and of itself shows that we execute anything that opening half wants better on our side. Second, what exactly does democracy stand for, and why do we think that it's just for good outcomes? There are a couple of reasons why we don't really think there's any inherent principle democracy. I think representation is a scam. We enslave 49% people all the time because they have to live under a locality or a power that they didn't consent to. If you ask a vast number of people whether they want votes or whether they want to live in Singapore, the vast majority of us would choose to live in Singapore, even if it means reducing our democratic ability to give consent. And there is very limited options of opting out because borders are often restrictive. What this shows is it's a system by which we want to maximize utility and good outcomes for people. Why can geographic proximity and geographic representation often not create these good outcomes? Directly engaging to O. We think wealth capture within each locality often happens through the relative privilege of old people who have captured wealth in those localities. This looks like wealthy individuals who go into the relatively suburban, richer part of that locality and end up having the relative wealth capture. Even if you're part of the minority, you're likely the older person who was part of that minority, the first generation of that minority, and becoming a richer person often is directly correlated to your age within that locality. This gives us two key insights. Number one, those within each locality that are most powerful are usually the older individuals, regardless of which locality we're talking about, because they were the first movers in capturing the wealth or the relative privilege within that locality. Number two, you often set up your own benefits that create disparities between what those older people want and what the younger people want. The best illustrations of this are the ways in which, even within localities, you often don't have interests that cater to the vast number of jobs for people, but look at housing for the rich. And this is exactly what we see even in localities within Chicago or Detroit, where your relative privilege, even within that locality, gives you superseding advantage. We think this changes the moment you start representing based on age. So it's not just that it's not just a disparity of localities, even within localities, age counts. Before going into climate change, I'll take opening.
So this is an argument for class, not age, but